Isabella's breath caught as she approached the polished mahogany counter, her children's small hands warm in hers despite the tremor in her own fingers. The customer service representative, a woman in her 50s with perfectly coiffed silver hair and a nameplate reading Margaret, looked up from her computer screen with the practiced smile that faltered the moment her gaze traveled from Isabella's face to her stained jacket. "Can I help you?" Margaret's tone carried the careful politeness reserved for people one hoped would leave quickly. "I need to access my safety deposit box, please." Isabella's voice maintained the crisp articulation that had once commanded respect in embassy halls across 3 continents. She reached into her frayed purse, producing a worn key and a laminated card bearing her name in faded letters. The twins pressed closer to her legs as Margaret's expression shifted from forced courtesy to barely concealed skepticism. Emma, always the more perceptive of her children, tugged on Isabella's coat. "Mommy, why is she looking at us like that?" Heat flushed Isabella's cheeks, but she kept her chin raised. "Box 247. The account is under Isabella Montclair." Margaret's manicured fingers clicked across her keyboard with unnecessary force. Behind them, Isabella could hear the whispered conversations of other customers, their words cutting through the sterile air like glass shards. Homeless. Those poor children. Security should really— "Ma'am, I'm going to need proper identification." Margaret's voice had grown colder. "And I should mention that this box requires additional verification for access. When was the last time you visited it?" 3 years ago. The admission felt like swallowing stones. 3 years since her world had imploded, since she'd blown the whistle on the arms trafficking operation that had tentacles reaching into the highest levels of government. 3 years since she'd become a ghost in her own life. Oliver, quieter than his sister but equally intuitive, stepped slightly behind Isabella's legs as a security guard began moving in their direction. The boy had learned to read the signs, the tightening faces, the protective gestures, the way authority figures positioned themselves when they were about to ask you to leave. "I understand this is irregular," Isabella said, her diplomatic training kicking in even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "But everything you need is there. My identification, my signature on file." "Ma'am." The security guard's voice cut through her words. He was younger than she'd expected, probably fresh out of some criminal justice program, eager to prove his worth. "Is there a problem here?" Margaret's relief was palpable. "Mr. Davidson, this woman claims to have a safety deposit box, but—" She gestured vaguely at Isabella's appearance, the unspoken words hanging in the air like smoke. Isabella felt the familiar burn of humiliation rise in her throat, the same sensation she'd experienced countless times over the past months, in shelters, soup kitchens, social services offices. The look that reduced her from a human being with a PhD in international relations and fluency in 4 languages to nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed. "The box exists," she said quietly, forcing herself to meet the guard's eyes. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to access what belongs to me." From across the lobby, she became aware of increased attention. Other customers had stopped their transactions to watch the spectacle. A mother pulled her child closer, as if poverty were contagious. An elderly man shook his head with the disappointed expression of someone witnessing the decline of proper society. But there was something else, a stillness in one corner that felt different from the collective judgment surrounding her. The quiet man in the expensive suit remained motionless, his attention focused not on her with the prurient curiosity of the other observers, but with something that felt almost protective. When their eyes met briefly, she caught something familiar in his gaze, though she couldn't place where she might have seen him before. "Look, lady," Davidson said, his hand resting on his radio. "Maybe you should come back when you're more prepared. We have procedures here, and you're causing a disturbance." Emma's grip tightened on Isabella's hand. The 6-year-old had witnessed this scene too many times, the moment when doors closed, when help was denied, when they were forced to retreat once again into the gray margins of a world that no longer recognized their right to exist within it. But Vault 247 contained more than documents. Inside that steel box lay the only tangible proof that the life they'd lost had been real, that Isabella hadn't imagined her former existence as someone who mattered. More importantly, it held evidence that could vindicate her, restore her security clearances, and give her children back the future that had been stolen from them. She straightened her shoulders, drawing on reserves of strength she'd thought were long depleted. "I'm not leaving without accessing my box." The words hung in the marble column space like a challenge, and Isabella realized that everything, their survival, their future, perhaps even their lives, would depend on what happened in the next few moments. The silence that followed Isabella's declaration stretched like a taut wire through the bank's marble lobby. She could feel the weight of every gaze, every judgment, pressing against her shoulders like physical force. This was her life now, a series of moments where she had to fight for dignity that had once been simply assumed. Davidson's hand moved closer to his radio, and Isabella recognized the choreography of rejection she'd seen performed countless times. In homeless shelters where beds ran out before the line ended. At the unemployment office where her overqualifications made her unemployable. At the children's school, before she'd been forced to pull them out entirely. "Please," she said, hating the way the word caught in her throat. 3 years ago, Isabella Montclair had never begged for anything. She'd been the one others came to for favors, her Rolodex filled with contacts across the diplomatic corps, her Georgetown townhouse a venue for dinner parties that shaped policy. Now she stood in a bank lobby, her children's futures hanging on the whim of a security guard young enough to be her student. Emma tugged at her coat again, and Isabella looked down into her daughter's upturned face. The 6-year-old's eyes held a wisdom that no child should possess, the hard-earned knowledge of when to be invisible, when to run, when to stand perfectly still and hope the storm passed over them. This was what she had to lose, Isabella realized with crystalline clarity. Not money or status or the career she'd sacrificed for principle. It was the last fragments of hope in her children's eyes, the belief that their mother could still protect, still make the world bend toward justice. Every day, she watched that faith erode a little more. Their morning routine had become a careful choreography of survival. Wake before dawn in whatever doorway or parking garage they'd found sanctuary in for the night. Help the twins wash with baby wipes and bottled water. Change them into the cleanest clothes from their single shared backpack. Emma never complained about wearing the same dress 3 days running, and Oliver had stopped asking when they could go home. Home. The word had once meant something concrete. A 3-story brick colonial with a garden where Emma had planted sunflowers and Oliver had buried treasure maps. Now home was wherever they could safely sleep for a few hours without being moved along by police or security guards. Isabella had tried to maintain normalcy for them, especially in those first months. She'd checked books out from the public library, conducting impromptu lessons on the steps of museums or in coffee shops where a single purchase could buy them an hour of warmth. Emma was naturally gifted with languages, switching effortlessly between the French and Spanish that Isabella taught her. Oliver had inherited his mother's analytical mind, solving math problems that challenged children twice his age. But maintaining their education while keeping them fed and safe had become an impossible equation. The children's needs grew more complex while her resources shrank. Oliver's asthma required medication they couldn't afford. Emma had started having nightmares that left her clinging to Isabella throughout the night, her small body shaking with terrors she couldn't articulate. The irony wasn't lost on Isabella that she'd once briefed senators on international humanitarian crises, had written policy papers on refugee assistance, had attended conferences on global poverty, all while living in comfort that insulated her from understanding what desperation truly felt like. The diplomatic corps had trained her to navigate complex political situations, but no amount of protocol expertise had prepared her for the labyrinthine humiliations of America's social safety net. Margaret's fingers had stopped clicking across her keyboard, but her expression remained skeptical. "Mrs. Montclair, even if I could verify your identity, the box you're referring to has specific access restrictions. I'm not authorized." "Then find someone who is." Isabella's voice carried an edge of authority that surprised even her. For a moment she sounded like the woman she used to be, the deputy attaché who had coordinated international trade delegations, who had sat across from ambassadors and made demands that governments listened to. The quiet man in the expensive suit shifted almost imperceptibly, and Isabella caught the movement in her peripheral vision. Something about his stillness felt familiar, like a melody she couldn't quite place. When had she developed this hyper-awareness of exits and potential threats? When had her children learned to read the mood of every room they entered? Oliver's small hand found hers, his fingers cold despite the bank's warmth. He was the quieter of the twins, more likely to internalize stress than voice complaints. Last week, she'd found him trying to comfort Emma after another failed attempt to find shelter, his thin arms wrapped around his sister, while he whispered promises he was too young to understand he couldn't keep. This was what survival looked like now. 3 people bound by love and desperation, carrying everything they owned in a backpack that grew heavier with each passing day. Every morning, Isabella woke with the same gnawing question: how much longer could she protect them from the reality that their mother might not be strong enough to save them? The answer, she was beginning to fear, waited in Vault 247. Margaret disappeared through a door marked Manager, leaving Isabella standing at the counter like an exhibit in a museum of failure. The whispers from other customers had grown bolder, no longer bothering to mask their conversations behind cupped hands. Davidson remained positioned nearby, his stance suggesting he was counting down the minutes until he could escort them from the premises. Isabella felt the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in her chest, the one that had become her constant companion since that first night sleeping in her car. She'd parked behind a 24-hour diner in Tacoma, watching the twins sleep in the back seat while she planned their next move. That was supposed to be temporary, a single night before she figured out how to reclaim their lives. 3 years later, the temporary had become their permanent reality. "Mommy," Emma whispered, pressing closer to her leg. "Are we in trouble?" Before Isabella could answer, Margaret returned with a tall man in his 60s, whose expensive suit and confident bearing marked him as someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. His nameplate read Richard Hawthorne, regional manager, and his expression suggested he viewed their situation as a puzzle requiring swift resolution. "Mrs. Montclair," Hawthorne said, extending his hand with practiced professionalism. "I understand you're trying to access Box 247. Isabella shook his hand, noting how his grip lingered a fraction longer than necessary, as if he were trying to reconcile her appearance with some internal expectation. "That's correct. I have the key and identification." "Yes, I see that." Hawthorne glanced at the documents Margaret had provided. "The challenge is that this particular box has been flagged in our system. There's a federal hold that requires additional verification before access can be granted." The words hit Isabella like ice water. "A federal hold? Since when?" "It appears to have been placed," Hawthorne consulted his tablet, "approximately 18 months ago. I'm afraid I don't have details about the nature of the restriction, only that any access attempts need to be reported to specific government contacts." Isabella's mind raced. 18 months ago, she'd still believed that keeping a low profile would eventually allow her to return to some version of her former life. She'd been naive enough to think that her whistleblowing would be vindicated, that the evidence she'd provided would lead to prosecutions rather than making her a target. The federal hold meant they hadn't given up looking for her, and more importantly, they knew exactly what was in that safety deposit box. "I need to speak with someone about removing that hold," Isabella said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew how impossible that request would be. She had no legal representation, no political allies, no leverage except for whatever evidence lay locked away behind steel and federal bureaucracy. Oliver tugged at her hand. "Mom, that man is looking at us funny." Isabella followed her son's gaze to the quiet observer in the corner, and this time, when their eyes met, she saw recognition flicker across his features. Not the casual recognition of someone who might have seen them around the neighborhood, but something deeper, more specific. The man stood, and Isabella noticed how his movement caused Davidson to straighten, as if the security guard sensed a shift in the room's dynamics. The stranger approached with deliberate steps, his expensive shoes silent on the marble floor. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying a slight British accent that sent an unexpected chill through Isabella's memory. "I couldn't help but overhear. You're trying to access box 247? Hawthorne frowned. "Sir, this is a private matter. My name is Captain Marcus Sterling." The man reached into his jacket, producing a leather credential case that he opened for Hawthorne's inspection. "Royal Protection Service." The words hung in the air like an impossible equation that didn't add up to any reality Isabella could understand. Royal Protection Service, British accent, and the way he was looking at her, as if she were a missing piece of a puzzle he'd been solving for years. "I've been looking for you, Mrs. Montclair," Sterling continued, his attention shifting entirely to Isabella. "Or should I say, Your Highness?" The bank lobby seemed to tilt around Isabella's vision. Emma's hand gripped hers tighter, and she could hear Oliver's breathing quicken beside her. This wasn't possible. She was Isabella Montclair, former diplomatic attaché, whistleblower, homeless mother of two. She wasn't anyone's highness. But Sterling was reaching into another pocket, producing a photograph that he held out to her. Isabella's hands shook as she took it. The image showed a woman who could have been her twin, wearing an elaborate gown and tiara, standing beside a man in military dress uniform. "Your grandmother," Sterling said quietly, "the Duchess of Ravenshallow. She died 3 years ago, which is when we began searching for her surviving heir." Isabella stared at the photograph, at a face that shared her own dark eyes and sharp cheekbones. Around them, the bank had fallen silent, even the whispers dying away as impossible realities collided with everything she thought she knew about herself. The call to adventure had found her at last. The photograph trembled in Isabella's hands as if it might disintegrate from the weight of its implications. She studied the woman's face, her own face, decades older and adorned with jewels worth more than most people's homes. The resemblance was undeniable, yet acknowledging it felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. "This is impossible," she whispered, though even as the words left her lips, fragments of half-remembered conversations began surfacing. Her mother's evasive answers about their family history, the way her grandmother had always spoken with a faint accent that never quite matched any region Isabella could identify. The locked trunk in the attic that had disappeared after her mother's funeral. Sterling stepped closer, his presence somehow both reassuring and terrifying. "I understand this is overwhelming. Perhaps we could speak somewhere more private?" "No." The word erupted from Isabella with surprising force. Emma and Oliver pressed against her legs, sensing her distress. "Whatever you think you know about me, whatever this photograph is supposed to prove, I can't. We can't." She thrust the picture back toward Sterling, but he made no move to take it. Around them, the bank's other customers had abandoned any pretense of conducting their own business, their attention fixed on the unfolding drama like spectators at a car accident. "Isabella." Sterling's voice was gentle but insistent. "Your children are the rightful heirs to—" "Stop." Isabella's chest felt tight, her breathing shallow. "My children are homeless. They sleep in parking garages and eat whatever I can find at food banks. They don't have a future beyond surviving until tomorrow, let alone some fairy tale inheritance." But even as she spoke, she could feel the weight of possibilities pressing against her consciousness. The federal hold on her safety deposit box suddenly made terrible sense. If there was truth to Sterling's claims, then the evidence she'd hidden wasn't just proof of governmental corruption. It was documentation of a bloodline that powerful people would kill to keep secret. Oliver tugged at her coat. "Mom, what's a highness?" The innocence in his voice nearly broke her. How could she explain that the man claimed they were royalty when yesterday she'd had to choose between buying them lunch and putting gas in the car? When Emma still cried herself to sleep asking why they couldn't go home. "It's nothing, sweetheart," she said. But the lie tasted like ash in her mouth. Sterling seemed to sense her internal struggle. "The Duchy of Ravenshallow has been held in trust for 3 years, waiting for the next in line. Your children wouldn't just inherit titles. There are substantial holdings, properties, financial assets that could provide them with everything they've been denied." At what cost? Isabella's voice cracked. You think I don't know how these things work? I was a diplomatic attaché. I know what happens to inconvenient heirs, to people who threaten established power structures. I've seen the bodies. The admission hung between them like a confession. Yes, she'd blown the whistle on arms trafficking, but the corruption ran deeper than weapon sales. She'd seen evidence of assassinations disguised as accidents, of entire bloodlines eliminated to protect geopolitical interests. The idea of exposing her children to that world, of painting targets on their backs for the sake of titles and wealth, made her physically ill. Sterling's expression softened. The Royal Protection Service exists precisely to prevent those outcomes. We've been searching for you not just to inform you of your inheritance, but to ensure your safety. The people who've been hunting you, they know what you are, even if you didn't. That's exactly the problem. Isabella wrapped her arms around her children, pulling them closer. You want me to believe that accepting this inheritance will protect them? That stepping into the light will somehow make us safer than staying invisible? She thought of all the nights she'd lain awake listening for footsteps, checking locks on doors that barely held, teaching Emma and Oliver to run if strangers approached. The paranoia that had kept them alive for 3 years would be nothing compared to the dangers of royal succession. Look at them, she said, gesturing to her children's upturned faces. Look at what this life has already taken from them. Emma hasn't been to school in 2 years. Oliver needs medical care we can't afford. They've never had friends, never had birthday parties, never had a single day where they weren't afraid. And you want me to add international intrigue to that? The photograph still lay in her palm, the Duchess's eyes seeming to judge her cowardice. But cowardice was a luxury Isabella couldn't afford. Every decision she made rippled through her children's lives, and she'd already made enough choices that had led them into darkness. Sterling waited, his patience suggesting he understood the magnitude of what he was asking. But understanding didn't make the choice any easier. The safety deposit box held evidence that could clear her name and restore their old life. This photograph offered something far more dangerous, a destiny that could either save them or destroy them completely. As Isabella stared into her grandmother's face, she realized that for the first time in 3 years, she faced a decision where both paths led into the unknown. The silence stretched between them like a bridge. Isabella wasn't sure she was brave enough to cross. Emma shifted restlessly against her leg, and Oliver's breathing had taken on the wheeze that meant his anxiety was triggering his asthma, another reminder of all the ways she'd failed to protect them from the consequences of her choices. But as she looked at the photograph again, really looked at it, something clicked into place. The Duchess wore the same expression Isabella had practiced in mirrors before diplomatic functions. Chin slightly raised, eyes direct but guarded, the careful mask of someone who understood that every word and gesture would be scrutinized. She'd thought she'd learned that bearing from her State Department training, but what if it had always been in her blood? The people hunting us, she said slowly, meeting Sterling's gaze. You said they already know what we are. That means running hasn't actually protected my children at all, has it? Sterling's silence was answer enough. The realization hit her like a physical blow. For 3 years, she'd sacrificed everything, their home, their stability, her children's childhoods, for the illusion of safety. But if Sterling was right, if their royal bloodline was already known to dangerous people, then all her careful hiding had accomplished nothing except ensuring Emma and Oliver suffered without purpose. Margaret had returned to her desk and was making hushed phone calls, probably reporting the presence of Royal Protection Service to whoever handled such impossibilities. Hawthorne remained nearby, his expression cycling between fascination and concern. Even Davidson seemed uncertain about protocol when faced with international royalty disguised as homeless Americans. Mom? Emma's voice was small. Are we really princesses? The question hung in the air like a prayer. Isabella looked down at her daughter's upturned face, dirt-smudged but hopeful, still believing her mother might somehow transform their world through sheer force of will. How many nights had Emma fallen asleep to stories of brave princesses who rescued themselves? How many times had Isabella spun fairy tales to distract from empty stomachs and cold parking lots? I don't know, baby, Isabella whispered. I honestly don't know. But she was beginning to understand that not knowing was no longer an option. The federal hold on her safety deposit box meant their enemies had been watching, waiting. The evidence she'd hidden could clear her name, but it wouldn't protect her children from people who saw them as obstacles to be eliminated. Royal titles and protection services might be their only chance at something resembling safety. Sterling reached into his jacket again, producing a small device that looked like a cross between a phone and a scanner. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward Isabella's hand. She hesitated for a moment, then extended her palm. The device emitted a soft blue light as Sterling passed it over her skin, and within seconds it chimed softly. "Biometric confirmation," he said quietly. "Your DNA matches the Ravenshallow royal line, there's no doubt." The words seemed to echo in the marble lobby, making everything else, the whispers, the traffic outside, even her children's breathing, fade into background noise. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity or elaborate fraud. She was exactly who Sterling claimed she was, which meant Emma and Oliver were exactly what he said they were: heirs to a throne, targets for elimination, children who deserved better than sleeping in cars and eating day-old bread. Isabella looked around the bank lobby, at the expensive marble and polished brass that had seemed so intimidating when she'd walked in. But she'd walked into rooms far more imposing than this, had negotiated with foreign ministers and briefed cabinet members on international crises. The woman who'd built a diplomatic career hadn't disappeared, she'd just been buried under 3 years of survival and desperation. "If I agree to this," she said, her voice steadying as she found her footing again, "what happens next? Do we just walk out of here and onto a plane to Europe? Do my children get thrown into some royal training program while assassins take target practice?" Sterling smiled for the first time since approaching them. "We start by getting you somewhere secure while we arrange proper documentation. Then we begin the process of reclaiming what's rightfully yours, safely and gradually." Isabella felt something shift inside her chest, like a door opening after being locked for years. She was tired of running, tired of watching her children shrink into themselves, tired of making choices based on fear rather than hope. "The safety deposit box," she said. "I still need access to that evidence." "The federal hold will be lifted within the hour," Sterling assured her. "Royal Protection Service has considerable influence with American intelligence agencies." Isabella took a deep breath, tasting possibility for the first time in 3 years. She looked down at Emma and Oliver, saw their confusion and hope warring in expressions too young to understand the magnitude of what was happening. "Okay," she said, the word feeling like stepping off a cliff and discovering she had wings. "We'll do it." There was no going back now. The moment Isabella spoke those words, the bank lobby seemed to transform around them. What had felt like a trap now felt like the first step toward something unimaginable. But Sterling's immediate response reminded her that accepting help came with its own complications. "First test," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "We need to leave here without drawing additional attention. The federal agencies monitoring your safety deposit box will have been alerted the moment I presented my credentials." As if summoned by his words, Isabella noticed 2 men in dark suits entering the bank's main entrance. They moved with the calculated casualness of people trying to appear inconspicuous while scanning every face in the room. Her diplomatic training kicked in automatically. She recognized the particular alertness of intelligence operatives, the way their eyes cataloged exits and potential threats. "Back exit?" she asked Sterling quietly, her hand finding Emma's shoulder. "Compromised. They'll have positioned teams at every entrance within minutes of my arrival." Sterling's calm was both reassuring and terrifying. "We're going to walk out the front door." Isabella's stomach lurched. "With my children?" "Trust me." Sterling reached into his jacket, producing what looked like a standard business card. "Mr. Hawthorne, I need to speak with your security chief immediately. Tell him Captain Sterling requires immediate consultation about international banking protocols." Hawthorne, who had been watching their whispered conversation with growing anxiety, practically leaped at the chance to be useful. Of course, right away. As the bank manager hurried toward the back offices, Sterling turned to Davidson. "I need you to escort these children to the family banking area. There's going to be some commotion in the main lobby, and they shouldn't see it. Wait! Isabella's grip on Emma and Oliver tightened instinctively. 3 years of survival had taught her never to let them out of her sight. They stay with me. Mom, it's okay, Emma said, her voice carrying a maturity that broke Isabella's heart. We know how to be good. The fact that her 7-year-old daughter was already strategizing for adult emergencies was exactly why Isabella had said yes to Sterling's offer. Emma and Oliver deserved to be children, not tiny refugees adapting to their mother's war. Sterling seemed to read her internal struggle. Davidson will remain with them at all times. There's a children's area with toys and books just around that corner. They'll be safer there for the next few minutes. Isabella knelt down to Emma and Oliver's eye level, her hands framing their small faces. Listen to me. Go with Mr. Davidson and stay exactly where he puts you. If anything feels wrong, anything at all, you remember what Mommy taught you about finding police officers, okay? Oliver nodded solemnly, but Emma's eyes were sharp with questions Isabella couldn't answer. Are the bad people here? I don't know, sweetheart. But Captain Sterling is going to help us make sure they can't hurt us anymore. She watched Davidson lead her children around the corner, every instinct screaming at her to follow. But Sterling was already moving toward the main entrance, and she realized this was her first lesson in the rules of his world. Sometimes, protecting the people you loved meant trusting others to help carry that burden. The two men in dark suits had separated, one approaching the teller windows while the other lingered near the customer service area. Isabella recognized their positioning immediately, classic surveillance formation designed to monitor all exit routes while maintaining plausible deniability about their purpose. Federal agents, she murmured to Sterling. Specifically, CIA contractors, the kind that operate in legal gray areas. Sterling's voice carried the weight of experience with such distinctions. They've been tracking you through facial recognition algorithms, waiting for you to surface somewhere. They could contain the situation quietly. Isabella felt the familiar chill of being hunted, but this time it was accompanied by something new: anger. For 3 years, she'd lived in fear of these people. She'd watched her children suffer because of their relentless pursuit. But now she had Sterling beside her, and behind his calm demeanor she sensed the kind of resources that could match their enemies' reach. What's the plan? She asked. We're going to introduce them to international diplomatic immunity. Sterling smiled, but there was steel beneath the expression. The moment I declared you under Royal Protection Service jurisdiction, this became a matter between two allied governments. They can't touch you without creating an international incident. Isabella watched as Hawthorne returned with a stern-looking woman in a security uniform. Sterling moved to intercept them, presenting additional credentials that made the security chief's eyes widen. Whatever authority he carried was clearly significant enough to change the entire dynamic of the situation. The CIA contractors had noticed the conference near the security desk. Isabella saw them exchange glances, their casual poses becoming more alert. This was the test Sterling had warned her about, whether his protection could actually shield her family from enemies who had been hunting them for years. Now we find out, Sterling said quietly, whether they're brave enough to challenge a royal decree. The tension in the lobby crystallized like frost on glass. Isabella watched the CIA contractors adjust their positions, their movements subtle but deliberate, predators recognizing that their prey had suddenly acquired dangerous allies. The lead agent, a man with prematurely gray hair and calculating eyes, was already reaching for what she assumed was a communication device. Sterling stepped forward with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to diplomatic battlefields. His voice carried clearly across the marble space as he addressed the security chief, but Isabella knew his words were really meant for the listening contractors. Under Article 12 of the International Royal Protection Accords, I'm placing Mrs. Montclair and her children under formal protective custody of the British Crown. Any attempt to detain or question them without going through proper diplomatic channels constitutes an act of aggression against a sovereign ally. The security chief's eyebrows shot up, but she nodded crisply and spoke into her radio. Whatever Sterling's credentials contained, they apparently carried enough weight to mobilize the bank's entire security apparatus in their favor. Isabella felt exposed, standing in the open lobby, every diplomatic instinct screaming that they should be having this confrontation somewhere with better exit strategies. But Sterling seemed entirely comfortable making their stand in full view of security cameras and civilian witnesses, which she realized was probably the point. The contractors could disappear people from dark alleys, but they couldn't simply vanish a royal heir from a public bank lobby without answering uncomfortable questions. The gray-haired agent approached them with the measured stride of someone testing boundaries. "Captain Sterling, I presume? I'm Agent Morrison, Department of Homeland Security." The lie came smoothly, accompanied by credentials Isabella was certain wouldn't survive close scrutiny. "We have an active security concern regarding Mrs. Montclair that supersedes any diplomatic considerations." "Do you?" Sterling's tone remained conversational, but Isabella caught the dangerous edge beneath his politeness. "I'd be very interested to hear the legal justification for surveilling a foreign royal family on American soil." Morrison's smile never wavered, but Isabella saw his jaw tighten. "Mrs. Montclair is an American citizen suspected of exposing arms trafficking that implicated senior government officials," Isabella interrupted, her diplomatic training finally overriding 3 years of hiding. "Suspected of having evidence that could embarrass people who prefer their criminal enterprises remain classified." The words hung in the lobby air like an accusation. Several customers and bank employees had stopped to watch the unfolding drama, and Isabella could see Morrison calculating whether the situation was escalating beyond their ability to contain quietly. Sterling moved slightly, positioning himself between Isabella and the second contractor, who had been slowly closing the distance to their conversation. "Agent Morrison, I'm going to give you an opportunity to contact your superiors before this becomes an international incident. Mrs. Montclair is under royal protection, which means any action against her requires approval from both the State Department and the Crown." "The Crown doesn't have jurisdiction over American criminals," Morrison replied, but his confidence was beginning to fray around the edges. "The Crown absolutely has jurisdiction over members of the royal family, regardless of their current citizenship status." Sterling produced yet another document, this one bearing official seals that made Morrison's eyes narrow. "Would you like me to contact the British Embassy directly, or would you prefer to explain to your handlers why you've created a diplomatic crisis over a 3-year-old whistleblowing case?" Isabella watched Morrison's face as he processed the implications. She'd seen that expression before in State Department meetings. The moment when an operative realized they were operating outside their authority, and the political fallout would land squarely on their shoulders. But before Morrison could respond, Isabella heard Emma's voice calling from the customer service area. Her daughter's tone carried the particular note that meant something was wrong, and every maternal instinct overrode diplomatic considerations. "Excuse me," she said to Sterling, already moving toward the sound of her children's voices. She rounded the corner to find Davidson standing protectively in front of Emma and Oliver, while a third contractor, one she hadn't noticed entering, attempted to engage Oliver in conversation. The man was crouched down to child height, his smile friendly and his questions innocuous, but Isabella's blood turned to ice. "Step away from my children." Her voice cut through the customer service area like a blade. The contractor straightened slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of harmless innocence. "Just saying hello to some cute kids. No harm in that." "There is when those children are under royal protection," Sterling said, appearing at Isabella's shoulder with Morrison close behind. "I believe threatening members of a royal bloodline qualifies as an act of terrorism under current international law." The lobby fell silent except for the soft hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic. Isabella gathered Emma and Oliver against her sides, feeling their small bodies trembling with confusion and fear. This was exactly what she'd been trying to protect them from, the moment when their childhood innocence collided with the brutal realities of adult power struggles. But as she looked at Morrison's increasingly desperate expression, Isabella realized something had fundamentally shifted. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't the one calculating escape routes and survival strategies. Sterling's presence had transformed them from hunted refugees into protected royalty. and their enemies were discovering that hunting a duchess carried very different consequences than pursuing a homeless whistleblower. The contractors were learning what Isabella was just beginning to understand. Everything had changed the moment she'd said yes. The safety deposit box vault felt like descending into a tomb. Isabella's hands shook as the bank manager, Mr. Hawthorne, led them through the reinforced steel door, his earlier condescension replaced by nervous deference to Sterling's authority. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made Emma's face look pale and frightened. "Box 1247, Hawthorne announced, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "I'll need both keys, yours and the bank's, plus biometric confirmation." Isabella reached into her jacket's inner pocket, fingers finding the small brass key she'd guarded for 3 years like a talisman. It had been her last connection to the woman she'd been before everything fell apart, before the late-night phone calls warning her to stop digging into the arms deals, before Marcus disappeared, before she'd loaded her children into their car with nothing but hopes and terror. "Mom?" Oliver whispered, pressing closer to her leg. "Why does everyone look scared?" Before she could answer, Sterling's phone buzzed with an urgent message. His expression darkened as he read, and Isabella felt her stomach drop. "What is it?" Morrison's team wasn't alone. Satellite surveillance shows at least 12 operatives positioned around the building's perimeter. Sterling's voice remained steady, but Isabella caught the tension beneath his calm. "They're not here to detain you quietly anymore. They're here to ensure that safety deposit box never gets opened." Isabella's blood turned to ice. "You're saying they'll kill us all if necessary," Sterling finished quietly. "The evidence you've hidden obviously represents an existential threat to someone with significant resources and absolutely no conscience." Hawthorne's face had gone ashen. "Perhaps we should postpone this." "No." Isabella's voice cut through the vault like steel. Every maternal instinct screamed at her to grab her children and run, but 3 years of running had taught her that some enemies never stopped hunting. If we leave now, they'll just follow us somewhere with fewer witnesses and better kill zones. She inserted her key into the safety deposit box lock, her hands steadying as diplomatic training overrode panic. "Emma, Oliver, stay directly behind Captain Sterling. Don't move from that spot no matter what happens." The dual locks clicked open, and Isabella lifted the metal box from its housing with reverence reserved for sacred objects. Inside, wrapped in waterproof plastic, lay not just the flash drives containing evidence of the arms trafficking conspiracy, but also documents she'd forgotten hiding, her grandmother's papers, written in faded French, alongside what looked like official government seals dating back decades. Sterling leaned closer, his breath catching. "Isabella, these aren't just family documents. These are royal succession papers, bloodline verification going back to the 1800s. I don't understand. Your grandmother wasn't just French aristocracy. She was the legitimate heir to the Ravenshallow throne, displaced during World War II." Sterling's voice carried amazement and growing alarm. "Which means Emma and Oliver aren't just distant cousins to European royalty. They're the direct line of succession." Isabella felt the world tilt on its axis. The safety deposit box hadn't just contained evidence to clear her name. It contained proof that her children were heirs to one of Europe's wealthiest royal houses, the kind of inheritance that people killed for, that governments toppled for, that turned innocent families into targets for elimination. "How much are we talking about?" she whispered. "Billions in holdings, land rights spanning 3 countries, and political influence that could reshape European economic policy." Sterling was already reaching for his communication device. "No wonder they've been so determined to eliminate your entire family. With you gone, the Ravenshallow inheritance would revert to distant cousins who've been cooperating with certain American interests for decades." The vault's lights flickered ominously, and Isabella heard the unmistakable sound of the bank's main power systems shutting down. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in an eerie red glow that made Emma whimper with fear. "They're cutting our communications and preparing to breach the building," Sterling said grimly. "We have maybe 10 minutes before they come through those doors with enough firepower to eliminate everyone who's seen these documents." Isabella looked at her children, really looked at them, seeing not just the scared little faces that had depended on her for everything, but the future monarchs whose existence threatened to expose decades of corruption and theft. Emma's eyes held the same sharp intelligence that had served Isabella in diplomatic negotiations. Oliver's quiet determination reminded her of her own grandfather, who'd survived 2 wars and built a fortune from nothing. "What's our play?" she asked Sterling, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "We stop running," Sterling replied, checking his weapon. "We make our stand here, and we let the world know exactly who your children are before anyone can silence us." Isabella gathered Emma and Oliver close, feeling the weight of destiny settling around their small family like armor. Everything they'd learned, everything they'd suffered, had led to this moment. The ordeal was just beginning. The lights went out completely. In the absolute darkness of the vault, Isabella's world collapsed into the terrified breathing of her children and the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Emma's small hand clutched her jacket with desperate fingers, while Oliver pressed against her leg, trembling. "Sterling?" Isabella's whisper seemed to vanish into the black void. No response. The silence stretched like a living thing, broken only by the distant sound of boots moving through the bank above them, heavy, coordinated footsteps that spoke of military precision and lethal intent. Isabella fumbled for her phone, the screen's pale glow revealing the truth she'd been dreading. Sterling was gone. The royal documents lay scattered across the floor where he'd dropped them, but the man who'd promised to protect them had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. "Mommy, where did the captain go?" Emma's voice cracked with the kind of fear that would haunt Isabella's dreams forever. "I don't know, sweetheart." The admission felt like swallowing glass. For one brief, shining moment, she'd believed they were finally safe. Sterling's confidence had been intoxicating, the promise that someone with real power was finally on their side. But in the end, he'd abandoned them just like everyone else. The footsteps above grew louder, accompanied by voices speaking in clipped, professional tones. Isabella recognized the cadence of tactical operations, the kind of coordinated breach that left no survivors and few questions. Morrison's team hadn't come to arrest her, they'd come to erase her family from existence. Isabella's phone showed no signal. The vault's steel walls had become their tomb, trapping them underground while killers moved through the bank above like a cleansing fire. Even if she could somehow get Emma and Oliver out of the vault, where could they go? The building was surrounded, their protector had fled, and their only evidence lay scattered across a concrete floor in a room that would soon become their grave. "The bad people are here, aren't they?" Oliver whispered, his 6-year-old voice holding too much understanding. Isabella gathered her children closer, feeling their small bodies shake with terror. 3 years of running, 3 years of sleeping in cars and eating from food banks and telling them that tomorrow would be better, all of it leading to this moment of absolute defeat. She'd promised them safety and delivered them directly into the hands of people who would murder children to protect government secrets. The vault door's electronic locks were completely dead. Without power, the magnetic seals had engaged automatically, turning their hiding place into an airtight prison. Isabella calculated their remaining oxygen with the cold precision of someone who'd already accepted the inevitable. Maybe they had an hour, maybe less. Her phone's light flickered across the royal documents that had cost them everything. Bloodline papers proving Emma and Oliver were heirs to billions in wealth and power, wealth they would never live to inherit. The irony was suffocating. She'd spent 3 years protecting children who were homeless refugees, only to discover they were actually displaced royalty moments before their execution. The footsteps above stopped directly overhead. Isabella heard voices conferring, followed by the distinctive whine of power tools. They were cutting through the bank's security systems, dismantling every barrier between themselves and their targets. Professional, thorough, and absolutely merciless. Isabella's phone showed 17 missed calls from unknown numbers. Sterling's last message, received just minutes before he'd vanished, contained only 3 words: "Forgive me. Run." Run where? The vault was a trap with steel walls and no exits. The bank above was crawling with killers. Even if by some miracle they escaped this room, Morrison's team would hunt them across continents. There was no running from people with unlimited resources and government backing. Emma started crying, not the loud wailing of a child seeking comfort, but the quiet, hopeless sobbing of someone who understood that the adults meant to protect her had failed. The sound cut through Isabella's chest like a blade, carrying all the weight of her failures as a mother and protector. The power tools stopped. In the silence that followed, Isabella heard new sounds, the deliberate footsteps of someone descending toward the vault level. They were coming. Isabella pulled Emma and Oliver behind the safety deposit box shelving, knowing it provided no real protection but unable to simply stand in the open and wait for death. Her children looked up at her with eyes that held too much trust, still believing somehow that their mother would find a way to save them. But there was no way out. Sterling had abandoned them. The evidence that could have cleared her name would die with them in this underground tomb. Emma and Oliver would never claim their royal inheritance, never know the life of privilege and safety that should have been their birthright. The vault door's manual override began to turn. Isabella closed her eyes and held her children close, whispering prayers to a God who seemed to have forgotten their existence. Everything was lost. The heavy vault door swung open with a metallic groan that echoed through the concrete chamber like a death knell. Isabella pressed Emma and Oliver deeper behind the safety deposit box shelving, their small bodies trembling against hers as footsteps approached through the darkness. But instead of Morrison's tactical team, a single figure appeared in the doorway. Sterling, his expensive suit torn and bloodied, his face grim with an expression Isabella had never seen before. Behind him lay the motionless forms of two contractors, their weapons scattered across the floor. "We have maybe 3 minutes," he said without preamble, rushing toward them. "I had to neutralize Morrison's advance team, but reinforcements are already moving through the building." "You left us," Isabella whispered, her voice raw with betrayal and desperate relief. "I drew them away from you." Sterling knelt beside the scattered documents, his hands moving with practiced efficiency to gather the royal papers. "Morrison's orders weren't to detain you, Isabella. They were to eliminate your entire bloodline and destroy all evidence of the Ravenshallow succession. This goes deeper than arms trafficking. This is about preventing your children from claiming a throne that controls 40% of Europe's rare earth mineral deposits." The words hit Isabella like physical blows. 40%? The Ravenshallow holdings aren't just ceremonial wealth. They're strategic resources that power everything from smartphones to military defense systems. Sterling secured the documents in a waterproof case, his movements urgent but careful. "Your grandmother's displacement wasn't just wartime chaos. It was a deliberate theft orchestrated by the same families who've been profiting from those mining rights for 70 years. Isabella's mind reeled as the true scope of their situation crystallized. This wasn't about government corruption or whistleblowing scandals. This was about trillions of dollars in mineral wealth that had been stolen from her family and distributed among American and European power brokers who would commit genocide to protect their illegal fortunes. "Emma, Oliver," she whispered, looking at her children with new eyes. They weren't just homeless refugees or even distant royal cousins. They were the legitimate owners of resources that could reshape global economics, and every day they remained alive represented an existential threat to some of the world's most powerful people. "There's more," Sterling continued, helping them toward the vault door. "Your diplomatic work in Eastern Europe wasn't random assignment. Your superiors knew exactly who you were. They placed you in positions where you'd eventually uncover the arms trafficking because they needed a way to discredit you before you discovered your real inheritance." The revelation struck Isabella like lightning, illuminating 3 years of confusion and betrayal with horrible clarity. Her own government hadn't just failed to protect her, they deliberately destroyed her life to prevent her from reclaiming what was rightfully hers. The late-night warnings, Marcus's disappearance, even their current homeless situation, all of it had been orchestrated to ensure Emma and Oliver never learned their true identities. "They killed Marcus," she said, the truth settling into her bones like ice. "They tried to kill Marcus," Sterling corrected. "He's alive, Isabella. hidden in protective custody while we gathered evidence to expose the entire conspiracy. He's been working with Royal Intelligence for 2 years to document the theft and prepare for this moment. Isabella's legs nearly gave out. Marcus was alive, the father her children barely remembered, the man whose loss had shattered their family, alive and fighting to restore everything that had been stolen from them. The grief that had consumed her for 3 years transformed instantly into something harder and more dangerous, hope backed by righteous fury. Above them, the sounds of tactical movement grew closer. Morrison's team was systematic and thorough, clearing the bank level by level as they moved toward their final targets. But Sterling's expression had changed from desperate urgency to cold calculation, and Isabella recognized the look of a man implementing a carefully planned strategy. The documents in that safety deposit box weren't just evidence, he explained, guiding them through the darkness. They were bait. Every moment you've been in this vault, Royal Intelligence has been documenting Morrison's illegal operations, recording his communications with his handlers, and tracing the financial networks that have been laundering Ravenshallow mineral profits for decades. Isabella understood with crystalline clarity. They hadn't been trapped in this vault. Morrison's team had been. Every illegal action they'd taken on American soil, every threat against royal heirs, every communication with their government conspirators had been monitored and recorded by intelligence services with both the authority and motivation to bring down everyone involved. "You're not victims anymore," Sterling said quietly as armed figures in different uniforms appeared at the vault entrance. Not contractors, but royal protection officers whose presence meant the tide had finally turned. "You're witnesses to the crime that's about to destroy everyone who tried to steal your children's birthright." For the first time in 3 years, Isabella felt the weight of powerlessness lift from her shoulders. The revelation wasn't just about royal blood or stolen wealth, it was about the moment when the hunted became the hunters, and justice finally found its voice. The royal protection officers moved through the vault with the silent efficiency of professionals who had planned this operation down to the second. Isabella watched in amazement as Sterling's earlier desperation transformed into the confident authority of a man who had been orchestrating events from the beginning. "Mrs. Montclair," one of the officers addressed her with formal respect that felt surreal after months of being dismissed as homeless refuse. "I'm Commander Hayes, Royal Intelligence Service. We need to debrief you and your children immediately, but first, are either of you injured?" Isabella shook her head, still struggling to process the complete reversal of their situation. Emma and Oliver pressed against her sides, their eyes wide as they watched uniformed officers secure the vault and establish what looked like a command center around the scattered safety deposit boxes. "Sterling," Isabella began, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and confused relief. "How long have you been planning this?" "Since the moment Marcus contacted Royal Intelligence 18 months ago." Sterling accepted a communication device from Commander Hayes, his torn suit and bloodied appearance suddenly seeming less like signs of desperate flight and more like evidence of calculated engagement. "He didn't just discover the arms trafficking conspiracy, Isabella. He uncovered documentation proving your grandmother's identity and the systematic theft of the Ravenshallow inheritance." The vault filled with the controlled chaos of a major intelligence operation. Officers photographed every document, recorded detailed statements about Morrison's team's illegal entry and threats, and established secure communication links that crackled with reports from locations across 3 continents. "Mommy," Emma whispered, tugging at Isabella's coat. "Are the bad people gone?" Before Isabella could answer, Commander Hayes knelt to Emma's eye level with the patience of someone accustomed to protecting royal children. "The bad people made a very big mistake today, Princess Emma. They broke laws in front of people who have been watching them for a very long time." Princess Emma. The title sent shockwaves through Isabella's understanding. Her daughter, who had been sleeping in car seats and eating from food banks, was being addressed with the formal respect due to actual royalty. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. "Morrison's entire team is in custody," Hayes continued, addressing Isabella directly. "More importantly, Their communications during this operation have implicated 17 American officials and 12 European conspirators in the theft of royal assets. The evidence we've gathered today will dismantle the entire network. Isabella felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. Not just relief, but a growing sense of power she hadn't experienced since her diplomatic career. For 3 years, she had been reactive, defensive, constantly fleeing from threats she couldn't identify or combat. But knowledge of her children's true inheritance changed everything. She wasn't just a mother protecting her family anymore. She was a guardian of legitimate royal interests with the full backing of international law. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Now we go home," Sterling replied. But his smile carried complexities that suggested home meant something entirely different than the car they'd been living in. The Ravenshallow estate has been maintained in trust for 70 years, waiting for the rightful heirs to return. Your children have palaces to see, territories to learn about, and a fortune that will ensure they never want for anything again. Oliver looked up at Isabella with the serious expression he'd worn since becoming homeless. "Will we have our own beds?" The question broke something open in Isabella's heart. Her 6-year-old son, a prince by blood and inheritance, asking for the basic comfort of his own bed because he'd spent a third of his life sleeping in cars and shelters. The injustice of what had been stolen from them crystallized into a cold, determined anger. "You'll have your own beds," she promised, her voice carrying new authority. "And your own rooms, and your own home that no one can ever take away from you again." Commander Hayes stood, extending an official document toward Isabella. "These are preliminary restoration papers, recognizing your maternal authority over the Ravenshallow succession until Prince Oliver reaches majority. Your diplomatic immunity has been restored, your financial assets unfrozen, and your family's safety is now a matter of international treaty." Isabella accepted the papers with hands that no longer trembled. The document felt substantial, official, backed by power that dwarfed Morrison's government connections. She was no longer a whistleblower hiding from corrupt officials. She was the mother of royal heirs with legal standing that transcended national boundaries. "There's one more thing," Sterling said quietly, producing a secure phone. "Someone wants to speak with you." Isabella accepted the device, her heart racing as she heard a familiar voice she'd mourned for 3 years. "Hello, my love," Marcus said, his voice carrying across continents and through her soul like sunlight after endless storms. "I'm coming home." The secure phone trembled in Isabella's hands as Marcus's voice wrapped around her like warmth after years of cold. She pressed the device closer to her ear, desperate to capture every nuance of words she'd never expected to hear again. "Marcus," she whispered, his name a prayer and an accusation simultaneously. "They told me you were dead. 3 years, Marcus. 3 years of believing—" "I know." His voice carried the weight of shared anguish. "Every day away from you and the children was agony. But Isabella, they had to believe I was gone. If Morrison's people suspected I was alive, they would have killed all of you immediately." Emma and Oliver pressed closer, their young faces reflecting confusion and growing recognition. Oliver's eyes widened as memory sparked, their father's voice filtering through static and distance, but unmistakably him. "Daddy?" Emma breathed, the word holding 3 years of grief and desperate hope. "Hello, my brave girl," Marcus replied, and Isabella heard the crack in his voice that spoke of barely controlled emotion. "I'm so proud of how you've taken care of Mommy and Oliver. You've been the strongest princess in the world." Isabella felt Commander Hayes's gentle presence as he guided them toward the vault exit, the royal protection officers maintaining security while respecting the profound intimacy of this reunion. The bank above had been transformed, no longer a crime scene, but a staging area for justice that had been decades in the making. "Where are you?" Isabella asked, needing practical details to anchor herself in this impossible reality. "London. I'm testifying before the International Court about the Ravenshallow conspiracy." "Isabella, what they stole from your family, from our children, it's bigger than we ever imagined. The mineral rights alone are worth more than most countries' GDP. Sterling appeared beside her as they ascended toward the main banking floor. "The court proceedings began this morning," he explained quietly. "Marcus's testimony, combined with the evidence gathered during Morrison's illegal operation today, will result in the largest international asset forfeiture in history." Isabella's mind struggled to process the magnitude of what she was hearing. They had gone from homeless refugees to displaced royalty to key witnesses in a case that would reshape international law. The transformation felt too rapid, too complete to be real. "When will you come home?" she asked Marcus, her voice breaking on the last word because home had been their car for so long that any other definition seemed impossible. "I'll be on a diplomatic flight within hours. There's a safe house in Georgetown where you'll wait for me, but Isabella—" His voice grew serious, carrying undertones that made her stomach clench. "Once we're together again, once the children's inheritance is public knowledge, everything changes permanently. There will be no going back to the life we had before." The weight of that reality settled over Isabella like a mantle she wasn't sure she was ready to wear. For 3 years, survival had been her only goal, keeping Emma and Oliver safe, fed, and sheltered. But now Marcus was asking her to embrace a future that involved royal obligations, international scrutiny, and responsibilities that terrified her more than poverty ever had. "I need to finish what we started," she said, the words emerging with surprising certainty. "The people who destroyed our lives, who stole our children's birthright, they need to face consequences for every family they've destroyed." Commander Hayes nodded approvingly as they reached the main banking floor, where federal agents were processing Morrison's captured operatives. "Your testimony will be crucial in the criminal proceedings, Mrs. Montclair. The conspiracy extends into the highest levels of government and international finance." Isabella watched Morrison himself being led away in restraints, his earlier confidence replaced by the hollow expression of a man whose illegal empire was collapsing in real time. The sight filled her with grim satisfaction, but also growing awareness that this was only the beginning of a much larger confrontation. "Marcus," she said into the phone, "how many others are there? How many people were involved in covering this up?" "Dozens of officials across 6 governments, Isabella. The final confrontation isn't just about recovering stolen assets. It's about exposing a network of corruption that's influenced international policy for generations." Isabella looked down at Emma and Oliver, saw their exhausted faces and 2 adult eyes, and felt something crystallize in her chest. They had survived 3 years of homelessness because of crimes committed against their family before they were even born. Now they faced a future where powerful enemies would never stop trying to reclaim what the courts were about to restore. But they were no longer running. They were no longer powerless. And Isabella was no longer the broken whistleblower who had fled into the night 3 years ago. "Then we finish it," she told Marcus, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had finally remembered what she was fighting for. "All of it. Every last person who thought they could steal our children's future. The road back to their real life would be paved with testimony, trials, and justice too long delayed." The secure transport to Georgetown moved through Seattle streets that looked different now. Not because the city had changed, but because Isabella finally understood who was watching from the shadows. Royal protection officers in unmarked vehicles flanked their convoy, while Commander Hayes maintained constant communication with intelligence services across 3 continents. Emma had fallen asleep against Isabella's shoulder, but Oliver remained wide awake, his 6-year-old mind processing revelations that would have overwhelmed adults. "Mommy," he said quietly, "if we're really a prince and princess, why did we have to live in the car?" The question cut straight to the heart of everything Isabella had been grappling with since leaving the vault. How could she explain to her children that their suffering had been orchestrated by people who viewed their lives as obstacles to maintaining stolen wealth? "Because some very bad people didn't want you to know who you really are," she replied, choosing simplicity over the complex truth of international conspiracy. "But now everyone knows, and they can never take that away from you again." Sterling, seated across from them in the armored vehicle, studied intelligence reports on a secure tablet. His expression had grown increasingly grim, as new information arrived from London, where Marcus's testimony was apparently triggering arrests in real time. "What's happening?" Isabella asked, recognizing the look of someone receiving troubling updates. "The network is larger than we anticipated," Sterling replied carefully, glancing at Oliver before choosing his words. "Your testimony tomorrow won't just be about the arms trafficking you originally discovered. The International Court needs your first-hand account of how the conspiracy destroyed your diplomatic career and forced your family into hiding." Isabella felt ice form in her stomach. Tomorrow, she would face representatives from 6 governments, tell the story of their homelessness and desperation, while knowing that her words would determine whether some of the world's most powerful people faced justice or continued profiting from stolen royal assets. "I'm scared," she admitted, the confession emerging before she could stop it. "Good," Commander Hayes said from the front seat, his tone surprisingly gentle. "Fear means you understand the magnitude of what you're facing. But Isabella, you've already survived the hardest part. You kept your children alive and safe for 3 years while being hunted by people with unlimited resources. Testifying in a protected courtroom is nothing compared to what you've already endured." The safe house appeared ahead, a nondescript Georgian mansion that looked like diplomatic housing but hummed with the subtle energy of high-level security. As their convoy pulled through reinforced gates, Isabella realized this was the first time in 3 years that she felt completely safe. Not just temporarily secure, but actually protected by power greater than the forces that had been hunting them. Emma stirred awake as the vehicle stopped, her sleepy eyes taking in manicured grounds and uniformed guards with growing wonder. "Is this our new house?" "Just for tonight, sweetheart," Isabella replied, though part of her wondered if anywhere would ever feel like home again. 3 years of homelessness had taught her that safety was temporary, that everything could disappear without warning. Inside the safe house, royal protection officers had prepared rooms that spoke of careful attention to traumatized children, soft furnishings, familiar foods, and most importantly, separate beds with fresh linens. Oliver touched his mattress with the reverence of someone who had forgotten what privacy felt like. Commander Hayes appeared in the doorway as Isabella tucked the children into their first real beds in months. "Mrs. Montclair, we need to prepare for tomorrow's proceedings. The testimony you provide will determine the scope of asset recovery and criminal prosecution." Isabella followed him downstairs to a secure conference room where walls of monitors displayed intelligence from around the world. Maps showed properties being seized, financial networks being frozen, and arrest warrants being executed across multiple time zones. The visual representation of their stolen inheritance being recovered in real time was staggering. "This is what they took from your family," Hayes explained, gesturing toward reports detailing decades of systematic theft. "But tomorrow you have the power to ensure it's returned. Not just the financial assets, but accountability for every family destroyed by this conspiracy." Isabella studied the evidence, recognizing the diplomatic postings where she'd unknowingly moved closer to discovering the truth. Her entire career had been manipulated, her assignments carefully designed to either keep her away from sensitive information or position her for discreditation when she inevitably uncovered too much. The phone rang, and Marcus's voice filled the room through speakers that made him sound close enough to touch. "How are they adjusting?" "Like children who've been carrying weight too heavy for their shoulders," Isabella replied, exhaustion finally overwhelming adrenaline. "Marcus, I don't know if I'm strong enough for what comes next." "You are," he said with absolute certainty. "You've already proven that by surviving 3 years of hell while protecting our children. Tomorrow, you use that strength to ensure no one else suffers what our family has endured." Isabella looked at the monitors showing the global scope of their fight and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. This wasn't just about reclaiming stolen inheritance anymore. It was about wielding the power to create justice that had been denied too long. Tomorrow would test everything she'd learned about survival, strength, and the price of truth. The morning sun had barely crested the Georgetown horizon when the secure phone shattered Isabella's fragile sleep. Commander Hayes's voice cut through the pre-dawn quiet with urgency that sent ice through her veins. "They're moving against the court," he said without preamble. Morrison's allies have orchestrated a coordinated strike to prevent your testimony from being heard. Isabella sat upright, her maternal instincts immediately checking the children's breathing in their adjacent beds. Emma and Oliver remained peacefully asleep, unaware that their newly discovered safety was already under siege. "What kind of strike?" Isabella whispered, moving to the window where armed guards patrolled grounds that no longer felt secure enough. "Legal challenges across 6 jurisdictions, attempting to classify your testimony as inadmissible due to your diplomatic immunity, being allegedly obtained through fraudulent means. They're arguing that the Ravenshallow inheritance itself is illegitimate." The audacity struck Isabella like a physical blow. After 3 years of homelessness caused by their conspiracy, the same people were now claiming her children had no right to the inheritance that had been stolen from them before they were even born. "Can they succeed?" she asked, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her growing fear. "Not if you testify today. The International Court has agreed to an emergency session, but Isabella—" Hayes paused, and she heard the weight of what he wasn't saying. "The testimony has to happen before the legal challenges can be processed. Which means you'll be facing their representatives directly, in the same room, with minimal security protocols." Isabella's blood turned to ice water. After 3 years of running from Morrison's network, she would be sitting across a conference table from the people who had orchestrated their family's destruction, the same individuals who had ordered her husband's apparent death and condemned her children to homelessness would be close enough to touch. "Marcus," she breathed into the phone. "Is Marcus already in the building? He's been waiting for you." The words should have brought comfort, but Isabella felt only growing terror. 3 years of survival had been about avoiding confrontation, staying invisible, keeping her children safe through anonymity. But today required the opposite, stepping directly into the light, facing her enemies, and trusting that justice would protect them when it had failed so catastrophically before. Emma stirred in her bed, sensing the tension that filled the room like electricity before a storm. "Mommy, are the bad people coming back?" "No, sweetheart," Isabella lied smoothly, though her hands trembled as she helped Emma dress in clothes provided by the Royal Protection Service. "Today we're going to make sure the bad people can never hurt anyone else again." Oliver emerged from sleep with the hyper-vigilance of a child who had learned that safety could disappear without warning. His 6-year-old eyes took in Isabella's tense posture and immediately understood that this day was different, dangerous, final. "Are we going to see Daddy?" he asked, his voice carrying hope and fear in equal measure. "Yes," Isabella replied, and this time the word felt like a promise she might actually be able to keep. "We're going to see Daddy, and we're going to end this forever." The armored convoy that transported them through downtown Washington moved like a funeral procession, slow, solemn, and surrounded by the weight of impending finality. Isabella watched familiar landmarks pass by and realized that everything depended on the next few hours. Either they would emerge as a restored royal family with justice finally served, or they would be fleeing into hiding again, this time with enemies who knew exactly who they were. The International Court building loomed ahead like a fortress of glass and steel, its modern architecture designed to project authority and impartiality. But Isabella could see the protesters already gathering, the media trucks positioning for maximum coverage, and the black vehicles that undoubtedly contained Morrison's allies preparing for their own version of battle. "Remember," Commander Hayes said as their convoy approached the secured entrance, "you're not just testifying about what they stole from your family. You're speaking for every diplomatic family they've destroyed, every whistleblower they've silenced, every child who suffered because corruption was more profitable than justice." Isabella nodded, though her throat felt too tight for words. Through the bulletproof glass, she could see a familiar figure waiting at the courthouse entrance, Marcus, alive and whole and real after 3 years of believing him dead. But even reunion couldn't diminish the magnitude of what lay ahead. The convoy stopped, and Isabella realized that everything, her children's future, their safety, the possibility of justice, would be determined by her ability to face the people who had tried to destroy them. After 3 years of running, hiding, and surviving, She was about to walk into a room with her enemies and trust that truth would finally be stronger than the conspiracy that had stolen their lives. The moment had arrived to discover whether courage could triumph over corruption, or whether some powers were simply too vast to overcome. The courthouse doors sealed behind them with the finality of a vault closing, and Isabella found herself face to face with Marcus for the first time in 3 years. He looked older, carved lean by whatever ordeal had kept him away, but his eyes held the same fierce love that had sustained her through countless nights of despair. Isabella. Her name on his lips was prayer and benediction combined. But before she could respond, before she could collapse into the embrace she dreamed of for 1,000 sleepless nights, Commander Hayes stepped between them with the urgency of a man bearing terrible news. "The legal challenges have been fast-tracked," he said, his voice cutting through their reunion like a blade. "Morrison's network has filed emergency injunctions in 6 courts simultaneously. If any one of them succeeds before your testimony concludes, everything we've recovered will be frozen indefinitely." Isabella felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "How long do we have?" 2 hours, maybe 3. Hayes's expression was grim. "But there's something else. Intelligence indicates they're not just fighting this legally anymore. There are credible threats against the children." The words hit Isabella like a physical blow. She spun toward Emma and Oliver, who were being escorted by Royal Protection officers toward a secured waiting area, their small figures dwarfed by the massive courthouse lobby. They looked so fragile, so impossibly young to be at the center of something this vast and dangerous. "Then we get them out," she said immediately. "We take them somewhere safe and abandon the testimony?" Marcus interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "Isabella, if you don't testify today, the legal challenges will succeed. Everything, the inheritance, the evidence, the arrests happening across 3 continents, it all disappears. Morrison's network walks away, and they'll have unlimited resources to hunt us forever." Isabella stared at her husband, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. "You're asking me to choose between protecting my children and securing their future. I'm asking you to trust that we can do both," Marcus replied, but she could see the uncertainty flickering behind his eyes. "The children will be in a secure wing with armed protection. You'll be testifying just floors above them. But Isabella, this is our only chance. If we run now, we'll be running forever." Through the courthouse windows, Isabella could see the media circus intensifying, protesters carrying signs demanding justice, and the sleek black vehicles that undoubtedly contained Morrison's allies. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for her decision. Commander Hayes checked his watch with visible tension. "Mrs. Montclair, the tribunal is convening in 30 minutes. If you're going to proceed, we need your final answer now." Isabella looked toward the secured area where her children waited, then at Marcus, whose 3 years of sacrifice were written in every line of his face. She thought of their car in Seattle, of Emma's quiet hunger and Oliver's 2 adult vigilance, of every cold night when she'd wondered if fighting for justice was worth the cost to her babies. "If I do this," she said slowly, "if I testify and expose everything, what guarantee do we have that it ends? What promise can anyone give me that there won't be others, that my children won't spend their lives looking over their shoulders?" "None," Marcus answered with brutal honesty. "But if we run now, they'll definitely spend their lives in hiding. At least this way, we're fighting for a chance at freedom." Isabella closed her eyes and saw 2 possible futures unfolding. One where they disappeared into witness protection, forever looking over their shoulders but safe in anonymity. Another where they stood in the light, claimed their inheritance and titles, but lived with the constant threat of those who would do anything to reclaim what the courts had restored. When she opened her eyes, she was looking at Oliver, who had broken away from his protection detail and was running toward her with 6-year-old determination. He crashed into her legs, looking up with eyes far too old for his small face. "Mommy," he said quietly, "I'm scared. But I'm more scared of always being scared." The wisdom in her son's words shattered something inside Isabella's chest. For 3 years, she had focused entirely on survival, on keeping them alive and hidden and safe. But Oliver was right. There was something worse than facing danger. There was living forever in its shadow. "Then we fight," she whispered, the words emerging with surprising strength. "We fight, and we trust that the truth is finally strong enough to protect us." Marcus's smile was radiant with relief and terror combined. Commander Hayes nodded grimly and spoke into his radio, setting events in motion that could not be undone. As Isabella walked toward the tribunal chamber, leaving her children under armed guard floors below, she realized the full cost of victory. To secure their future, she would have to risk everything they had fought to preserve. The sacrifice wasn't just her safety or her anonymity, it was the certainty that came with hiding. Today, she would step into the light, and they would all live with the consequences forever. The tribunal chamber fell silent, as Isabella's final words echoed against marble walls, her testimony complete after 3 hours of relentless questioning. She had laid bare every detail of the conspiracy, identified every stolen asset, and faced down Morrison's representatives with a composure that surprised even herself. Now, as the justices conferred in hushed tones, the weight of what she had just accomplished settled over her like a heavy blanket. Commander Hayes appeared at her elbow, his expression unreadable. "The children are asking for you," he said quietly. "Emma hasn't stopped crying since the session began." Isabella's maternal instincts, held in check for hours of testimony, flooded back with crushing force. She had done what needed to be done, but at what cost to her babies? Oliver's brave words about being more scared of always being scared seemed hollow now, faced with the reality of 6-year-old tears and fear. The secured elevator descended toward the children's waiting area with agonizing slowness. Through reinforced glass, Isabella could see protesters still gathering outside, their signs demanding justice now mixed with others calling for royal accountability. The world was watching, waiting for the tribunal's decision, but all she wanted was to hold her children and tell them the nightmare was finally over. Except it wasn't over, not yet. Marcus met her at the elevator, his face drawn with exhaustion and something deeper, the recognition that victory came with its own burdens. "The preliminary ruling should come within the hour," he said, taking her hand for the first time in 3 years. His fingers were warm, real, alive, but somehow the touch felt different than her memories had promised. "How do we explain this to them?" Isabella whispered, as they approached the children's secure room. "How do we tell them that winning means their lives will never be normal again?" Through the observation window, they could see Emma curled in a corner chair, clutching a stuffed animal provided by the protection detail. Oliver sat rigidly beside her, his small hands clenched into fists, trying to be brave for his sister while clearly terrified himself. The sight broke something inside Isabella's chest that 3 years of homelessness hadn't managed to touch. "We tell them the truth," Marcus replied, "that sometimes doing the right thing is harder than doing the safe thing, but that we chose to fight because we love them too much to let them live in fear forever." The children looked up as their parents entered, and Isabella saw the exact moment when hope and relief warred with confusion on their faces. They ran to her, small bodies colliding with hers in a desperate embrace that spoke of 3 years of separation and terror finally finding release. "Mommy, are we safe now?" Emma asked, her voice muffled against Isabella's shoulder. "Yes, sweetheart," Isabella replied, though the word felt incomplete. They were safe from the immediate danger, safe from Morrison's network that was even now being dismantled across 3 continents. But they would never be safe from the responsibilities that came with their recovered inheritance, never safe from the scrutiny of being royal heirs, never safe from those who would see them as symbols rather than children. Oliver pulled back to study his father's face with an intensity that belonged on someone decades older. "Daddy, why do you look sad when we won?" Marcus knelt to his son's eye level, and Isabella watched her husband struggle with the same realization that was settling over her like lead. "Because winning isn't always what we expect it to be, Oliver. Sometimes getting what we wanted means our lives change in ways we didn't anticipate." A sharp knock interrupted the reunion. Commander Hayes entered with papers that crackled with official seals and the weight of international law. "The preliminary ruling has been issued," he announced, his tone carefully neutral. The tribunal has found in favor of the Montclair petition. Asset recovery will proceed immediately, and arrest warrants for Morrison's network are being executed as we speak. Isabella felt her knees weaken with relief and terror combined. They had won. After 3 years of running, hiding, and surviving on hope alone, they had actually won. But the victory felt strangely hollow, weighted with implications she was only beginning to understand. "What happens now?" she asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. "Now you go home," Hayes replied. "To Ravenshallow Castle, to your titles and responsibilities, to the life that was stolen from you before your children were born." He paused, studying their faces. "But understand, this isn't the end of your story. This is the beginning of a very different one." Through the windows, Isabella could see the media circus intensifying as news of the ruling spread. Camera crews, royal watchers, and curious crowds were gathering like storm clouds, all eager for their first glimpse of the homeless family who had just reclaimed a kingdom. Emma tugged at Isabella's sleeve. "Mommy, what's a castle?" Isabella looked at her daughter, then at Oliver, then at Marcus, and realized that everything they had fought to preserve, their anonymity, their simple dreams of safety, had been sacrificed to secure something far more complex and demanding. They had won their inheritance. Now they would have to learn whether they could survive their victory. The private jet soared above clouds that stretched like cotton fields toward distant horizons, but Isabella found no peace in the view. Beside her, Emma pressed her face to the window with wonder, pointing at landscapes that would soon be part of her inheritance, while Oliver sat rigidly upright, overwhelmed by the magnitude of their transformation. In less than 24 hours, they had gone from a family with nothing to heirs of a European principality most people couldn't locate on a map. "Look, Mommy!" Emma exclaimed, her voice bright with excitement that hadn't dimmed since learning about castles and crowns. "The houses look like toys." Isabella smiled, but the expression felt foreign on her face. For 3 years, every emotion had been filtered through survival, every decision weighed against immediate danger. Now, faced with luxury and security she had almost forgotten existed, she felt oddly disconnected from joy. The woman who had clutched her children's hands outside First National Bank in the rain seemed like a stranger, though only days had passed since that desperate morning. Marcus reached across the aisle to touch her hand, and she startled at the contact. His presence still felt surreal, a miracle she couldn't quite accept as permanent. Death had been easier to process than this careful resurrection of their marriage, this attempt to rebuild intimacy around the crater of 3 lost years. "The advance team confirms Ravenshallow is secure," he said quietly. "The staff has been vetted, the grounds swept. Commander Hayes has positioned security throughout the estate." Isabella nodded, though the words felt like a foreign language. Staff, grounds, estate. Concepts that belonged to someone else's life, not to a woman who had learned to make dinner from food bank donations and wash clothes in gas station restrooms. The Isabella Montclair, who had once moved effortlessly through diplomatic circles, felt as dead as she had believed Marcus to be. "How am I supposed to do this?" she whispered, low enough that the children couldn't hear. "How am I supposed to be royal when I don't remember how to be anything but afraid?" Marcus squeezed her fingers, and she saw her own uncertainty reflected in his eyes. "We'll learn together, all of us." But learning felt like an inadequate word for the transformation ahead. The tribunal's ruling had restored their titles, their wealth, their legal identity, but it couldn't restore the people they had been before the conspiracy destroyed their world. Isabella looked at her reflection in the plane's window and saw a woman carved lean by deprivation, marked by hypervigilance, changed in ways that no amount of luxury could erase. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their descent toward what he called the Principality, and Isabella's stomach clenched with fresh anxiety. Below them, Ravenshallow waited, a castle she barely remembered, a title she had never expected to inherit, a responsibility she felt utterly unequipped to bear. "Will there be other children there?" Oliver asked suddenly, his first words in hours. "I don't know," Isabella admitted. The honest answer seemed better than false promises, though she watched him retreat further into himself at the uncertainty. Her son had become an expert at reading adult anxiety, at preparing for disappointment before hope could take root. As the plane touched down on a private airstrip surrounded by rolling hills and ancient forests, Isabella felt the weight of return settling over her like a heavy cloak. This wasn't coming home. It was arriving at a place that shared her name but not her memories, accepting a role she had never chosen for children who would now be defined by bloodlines they couldn't understand. The castle emerged through the trees as their motorcade wound through countryside that belonged to them, its towers and battlements speaking of centuries her children would now represent. Emma gasped with delight at the sight, but Isabella felt only vertigo at the vastness of what they were claiming. "It's bigger than I imagined," Marcus said, his voice carrying the same disbelief that echoed in Isabella's chest. A reception line waited on the castle's stone steps, household staff in formal uniforms, local officials with carefully neutral expressions, Commander Hayes with his team of security specialists. Isabella realized they were all waiting for her to be someone she had never learned to become. She stepped from the car with Emma's hand in hers, and Oliver pressed close to her side. Three people wearing clothes that didn't belong to them, approaching a life that felt like an elaborate costume drama. The woman who had begged for access to a safety deposit box was gone, replaced by someone expected to embody tradition and authority she didn't possess. But as they climbed the castle steps together, Isabella felt something unexpected stirring beneath the fear and uncertainty. Not confidence, that would take time to rebuild. Instead, she felt the fierce protectiveness that had sustained them through 3 years of homelessness transforming into something new. She might not know how to be royal, but she knew how to fight for her children's futures. The massive doors opened before them, and Isabella walked into her inheritance, forever changed, irrevocably different, but finally impossibly home. The great hall's vaulted ceiling seemed to swallow their footsteps as Isabella walked deeper into Ravenshallow Castle, her children flanking her like small sentries navigating an alien world. 6 months had passed since that first overwhelming day of arrival, and the morning sunlight streaming through medieval windows now illuminated a scene that would have been unimaginable during their years of homelessness. Emma sat at the ancient oak dining table, her legs swinging freely as she practiced her letters with a governess who had infinite patience for 6-year-old questions about why princesses needed to know arithmetic. Oliver worked quietly beside her, his natural intensity now channeled into studies that challenged rather than overwhelmed him. The rigid hypervigilance that had once defined his small shoulders had softened into ordinary childhood concentration. Isabella watched them from the doorway, marveling at their resilience. Children, she had learned, possessed an almost mystical ability to adapt, to find normalcy in the most extraordinary circumstances. What had seemed impossibly vast to her on that first day had become simply home to them. Castle corridors were playground territories, ancient portraits were familiar faces, and the household staff had transformed from intimidating strangers into surrogate grandparents who spoiled them with patient affection. "Your Grace," Mrs. Pemberton, the head housekeeper, appeared at her elbow with the quiet efficiency that characterized all of Ravenshallow's staff. "The Education Minister's delegation has arrived for this afternoon's meeting about the children's curriculum." Isabella nodded, though the formal address still felt like someone else's name. She had asked the staff repeatedly to use her given name, but centuries of protocol weren't easily abandoned. They compromised by using her title with warmth rather than distance, making royalty feel less like performance and more like family tradition. The castle had taught her that transformation wasn't a single event, but an ongoing process of becoming. Each morning brought new responsibilities she was learning to shoulder, new decisions that affected not just her family but the thousands of people who looked to Ravenshallow for leadership and stability. The scared woman who had once slept in her car still lived inside her, but she was no longer the only voice in Isabella's head. Marcus found her in the library after the delegation's departure, surrounded by books about regional development and economic policy. Marriage, too, was proving to be an ongoing transformation. They were rebuilding their relationship from fragments of memory and changed people, learning to love the individuals they had become rather than mourning who they used to be. "The children want to show you something," he said, his smile carrying the easy warmth that had taken months to return. "Emma's been working on it all week." They walked together toward the castle's east wing, where Isabella had established a family wing that felt more like home than monument. The formal reception rooms were necessary for state functions, but these private spaces belonged entirely to them, filled with comfortable furniture, children's artwork, and the organized chaos of family life. Emma bounced excitedly as they entered the sitting room, gesturing toward a large drawing taped to the wall. It showed 4 stick figures standing in front of a recognizable castle, but what struck Isabella was the completeness of the scene. No searching faces, no empty spaces where people should be. Just a family, together, home. "That's us," Emma announced proudly. "Oliver helped with the castle, but I drew the people." Isabella knelt to study the artwork more closely, noting details that spoke to her daughter's growing sense of security. The figures stood close together but not desperately clutched. They had faces marked with smiles rather than worry. Most remarkably, they looked settled, planted, permanent. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Isabella said, meaning it completely. Oliver, never one for dramatic gestures, simply leaned against her side in the comfortable silence that had replaced his earlier vigilance. At 8 now, he was growing into someone thoughtful, rather than watchful, curious about the world beyond their family's survival. That evening, after the children were asleep in bedrooms that had become genuinely theirs, Isabella stood on the castle's ramparts looking out over lands that stretched to distant hills. The view was magnificent, but what struck her most was the absence of fear in her appreciation of it. For the first time in years, she could see beauty without calculating escape routes, could plan for tomorrow without preparing for loss. Marcus joined her in the moonlight, and they stood together in comfortable silence. 2 people who had learned that healing wasn't about returning to who they used to be, but about growing into who they were meant to become. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked eventually. "The simplicity of just surviving?" Isabella considered the question honestly. There were moments when the weight of responsibility felt overwhelming, when she longed for decisions that affected only her immediate family, rather than thousands of subjects who depended on Ravenshallow's leadership. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I remember that we weren't just surviving. We were diminished, all of us, living so much smaller than we were meant to be." Below them, the castle grounds spread in peaceful darkness, home to a family that had learned the difference between safety and freedom, between hiding and belonging. They had traveled an impossible distance from that rain-soaked morning in Seattle to this moonlit moment of quietude. Isabella Montclair, once homeless and desperate, now royal and responsible, smiled into the night and knew herself to be exactly where she belonged.